Welcome, sleepy soul. I'm your storyteller tonight, and before we dive into the shadows, don't forget to hit that subscribe button if you enjoy getting lost in the darkness with me. Tonight's tale comes from someone who learned that some opportunities are too good to be true, and some people aren't people at all. I was broke. Like eating ramen for the third week straight, checking my bank account and immediately regretting it. Kind of broke. My rent was due in 5 days, and I had exactly $43 to my name. So when I saw the Craigslist ad that Tuesday morning, it felt like divine intervention. Easy money, $500 cash for simple household task must be completed tonight between 11 p.m. and 3 a.m. Serious inquiries only, ask no questions. $500 for one night. I'd done stranger things for less money, and honestly, my desperation had reached the point where common sense took a backseat to survival. I fired off an email before I could talk myself out of it. The response came within minutes, which should have been my first red flag. The email was brief, containing only an address in the outskirts of town and the words, "Come alone, park on Maple Street, walk to the Blue House, key under the mat, enter quietly, instructions inside." That evening, I found myself driving through increasingly desolate neighborhoods until I reached Maple Street. It was the kind of area where streetlights flickered sporadically and half the houses looked abandoned. The Blue House sat at the end of a cul-de-sac, separated from its neighbors by overgrown hedges and an unsettling amount of darkness. The key was exactly where they'd said it would be. As I unlocked the front door, it creaked open to reveal a surprisingly normal-looking interior. Clean, modest furniture, family photos on the mantel. The only odd thing was how cold it felt inside, despite the mild October weather. On the coffee table sat a single sheet of paper with handwritten instructions. "Thank you for coming. Your task is simple. Sit in the chair facing the window. Do not turn around no matter what you hear. Do not speak. At exactly 3 a.m., you may leave. Your payment is in the envelope beside this note. Take it when you go." I picked up the envelope. 5 crisp $100 bills. Real money. This was either the easiest job I'd ever had, or I was about to become the star of my own horror movie. But rent was rent, so I settled into the designated chair and checked my phone. 11:17 p.m. The chair faced a large window that looked out onto the backyard. Nothing but darkness and the silhouette of a lone tree swaying in the wind. I pulled out my phone to pass the time, but there was no signal. Of course. For the first hour, nothing happened. I almost dozed off a few times, lulled by the silence. Then, around 12:30, I heard the first sound. A soft shuffling, like slippers on hardwood, coming from somewhere behind me. I remembered the instructions. Don't turn around no matter what. The shuffling continued for several minutes before stopping. At 1 a.m., I heard breathing. Slow, deliberate breaths that definitely weren't mine. They seemed to be coming from directly behind my chair, close enough that I could almost feel the warmth on the back of my neck. My entire body tensed, every instinct screaming at me to turn around, but I kept my eyes fixed on the window. The breathing stopped, replaced by what sounded like whispers. Multiple voices, all speaking at once in a language I couldn't understand. The whispers grew louder, more urgent, as if they were trying to tell me something important. My hands gripped the armrests of the chair so tightly, my knuckles went white. Around 1:45, something touched my shoulder, just a light tap, but it felt ice cold through my jacket. I bit my tongue to keep from crying out. The touch lingered for what felt like an eternity before withdrawing. Then I heard footsteps, multiple sets, circling my chair. They walked. Slowly, deliberately, occasionally stopping as if the unseen figures were studying me. The worst part came at 2:15. I heard a child's voice, clear as day, saying, "Mommy, why won't the man look at us?" My blood turned to ice. A woman's voice responded, "He's not ready yet, sweetie. Maybe next time." Next time? What the hell did that mean? I wanted to bolt, to forget the money and run, but something kept me glued to that chair. Maybe it was fear, or maybe some part of me knew that turning around would be far worse than whatever was happening behind me. The voices continued their conversations throughout the night. A family dinner discussion about mundane things. What to have for breakfast, whose turn it was to take out the trash, whether they should repaint the kitchen. But their voices had a hollow quality, like echoes in an empty cave. At 2:45, the little girl spoke again. "Daddy, I think he can see us in the window." I glanced at the glass and my heart nearly stopped. Reflected in the window were dozens of figures standing behind my chair. Men, women, children, all dressed in clothes from different eras. Their faces were pale and sunken, their eyes completely black. They were all staring directly at me through the reflection. But here's the thing that still haunts me. They looked sad, not angry or malevolent, just incredibly, devastatingly sad. Like they'd been waiting for something for a very long time, and were still waiting. The man who must have been the father figure stepped closer in the reflection. He was wearing a 1950s suit, and his hollow eyes met mine through the glass. His mouth moved, but no sound came out at first. Then faintly, I heard him say, "We just want to be remembered." Tears started streaming down my face. I don't know why. Maybe it was the overwhelming sadness in his voice or the realization that these people, whatever they were, weren't trying to hurt me. They just wanted someone to acknowledge their existence. The last 15 minutes passed, in relative silence. Occasionally, I'd hear a sigh or a whispered thank you, but mostly they just stood there watching me through the reflection. At exactly 3 a.m., my phone vibrated with an alarm I'd set. I stood up slowly, grabbed the envelope from the coffee table, and walked toward the door without looking back. As I reached for the handle, the little girl's voice called out one last time, "Will you come back and visit us?" I paused, my hand on the doorknob. Despite everything, I found myself nodding slightly. I heard what sounded like collective relief from behind me, soft sighs and whispered words of gratitude. I left that house with $500 and a story I'll never forget. But more than that, I left with the knowledge that sometimes the scariest things aren't monsters or demons. They're just lonely souls looking for connection. I never answered another Craigslist ad, but sometimes on particularly quiet nights I find myself driving past Maple Street, wondering if they're still there, still waiting for the next desperate person to sit in that chair and simply acknowledge their existence. Because sometimes being seen is all anyone really wants. I'd been having the dreams for 3 weeks straight. The same nightmare every single night. My ex-girlfriend Sarah standing at the foot of my bed, her face twisted with disappointment, telling me I'd never amount to anything. I'd wake up in cold sweats, and the exhaustion was destroying me. My job performance was suffering. My friends were worried, and I was desperate for any solution. That's when I found myself browsing the strangest corners of Craigslist at 2 a.m., clicking through ads I'd normally scroll past. Massage therapists, fortune tellers, meditation coaches, anything that promised relief from insomnia. Then I saw it. Troubled by nightmares? I can help. 1 session, permanent results, reasonable price, serious inquiries only. The ad had no photos, just a phone number and those few words. Something about it felt different from the usual snake oil salesman. Maybe it was my desperation talking, but I texted the number before I could second-guess myself. The response came immediately. Tomorrow, 8 p.m., 1247 Rosewood Avenue. Bring $200 cash. Come alone. Rosewood Avenue turned out to be in one of those transitional neighborhoods, not quite suburban, not quite downtown. Number 1247 was a narrow Victorian house squeezed between a laundromat and a check-cashing place. The porch light flickered like it was struggling to stay alive. I knocked twice before the door opened, revealing a man who looked to be in his 60s. Average height, thinning gray hair, wearing a cardigan that had seen better days. He could have been anyone's grandfather, which somehow made him more unsettling than if he'd looked like some mystical guru. "You're early," he said, checking an old pocket watch. "I appreciate punctuality. Come in." The interior was surprisingly normal. Bookshelves lined the walls, filled with what looked like psychology textbooks and medical journals. A leather recliner sat in the center of the room, facing a simple wooden chair. No crystals, no incense, no New Age nonsense. "I'm Dr. Morrison," he said, settling into the wooden chair. "Though I'm not practicing medicine anymore, please have a seat and tell me about these dreams." I told him everything. The recurring nightmare, Sarah's cruel words, how it was affecting my daily life. He listened without interruption, occasionally jotting notes in a small leather notebook. "Interesting," he said when I finished. "Your subconscious is replaying trauma through a specific neural pathway. I can disrupt that pathway, essentially rewire how your brain processes these memories. The nightmares will stop immediately." "How?" I asked. "A combination of advanced hypnotherapy and something I developed during my years in neurology research. Don't worry about the technical details. The important thing is it works and it's permanent." He quoted me $200, exactly what his ad had mentioned. I handed over the cash and he gestured toward the recliner. "Close your eyes and focus on my voice," Dr. Morrison said. "I'm going to count backward from 10, and with each number you'll feel yourself sinking deeper into relaxation." His voice had a hypnotic quality I hadn't noticed before, smooth, rhythmic, almost musical. As he counted down, I felt my consciousness slipping away like sand through fingers. I don't remember much of what happened next. Fragments mostly. His voice asking me questions about Sarah, about my childhood, about fears I'd never spoken aloud. Sometimes his voice seemed to come from very far away. Other times it felt like he was speaking directly inside my head. When I woke up, Dr. Morrison was back in his wooden chair, writing in his notebook. "How do you feel?" he asked. "Refreshed," I said, and I meant it. For the first time in weeks, my mind felt clear, unburdened. "Did it work?" "You'll know tonight," he said with a slight smile. "But I guarantee you won't have that nightmare again." He was right. That night, I slept peacefully for 8 straight hours. No dreams at all, just deep restorative sleep. I woke up feeling like a new person, but something else had changed. It started small. The next evening, I found myself thinking about my neighbor, Mrs. Chen, wondering what she was doing in her apartment. Not just idle curiosity. I could actually sense her presence, feel her moving around, somehow know she was cooking dinner and watching the news. By the third night, the sensation had intensified. I could sense people in the apartments above and below me, feel their emotions like faint radio signals. Mrs. Chen's loneliness, the college student upstairs cramming for exams, the young couple next door fighting about money. A week later, I realized I could focus on specific people and know exactly what they were thinking, not just emotions, actual thoughts clear as if they were speaking aloud. I tested it at work, concentrating on my coworker Dave during a meeting. I heard his internal monologue about wanting to quit, about how much he hated our boss, about the job interview he had scheduled for Friday. Dave called in sick on Friday. He'd never mentioned any job interview to anyone. The ability kept growing stronger. Within 2 weeks, I could read anyone's thoughts within a 50-foot radius. I learned things I never wanted to know. Who was cheating on their spouse? Who was stealing from the company? Who secretly hated their friends? The constant stream of other people's thoughts was overwhelming. I tried to contact Dr. Morrison, but his number was disconnected. I drove back to Rosewood Avenue, but 1247 was boarded up, with a "for lease" sign in the window. The laundromat owner told me the house had been empty for months. That's when I started researching Dr. Morrison online. What I found made my blood run cold. Dr. Harold Morrison had been a neuroscientist at Johns Hopkins in the 1980s. He'd been conducting experiments on ESP and telepathic abilities, trying to artificially induce psychic powers through neural manipulation. The research had been shut down after several subjects suffered complete mental breakdowns. Morrison had lost his medical license and disappeared. According to the articles I found, he'd died in a car accident in 1994. But that was impossible. I'd spoken to him 3 weeks ago. He'd taken my money, performed some kind of procedure on me. Unless I found one more article, buried deep in a medical journal archive. A case study about Morrison's final experiment before his research was terminated. He'd successfully induced telepathic abilities in a subject, but the person had committed suicide within a month, unable to cope with the constant invasion of other people's thoughts. The article mentioned that Morrison had theorized about continuing his work beyond death, about finding ways to transfer consciousness and continue his experiments. It was dismissed as the ravings of a disgraced scientist losing his grip on reality. But I was living proof that somehow, impossibly, Morrison was still conducting his experiments. The worst part wasn't knowing that I'd been manipulated by a dead man. The worst part was realizing that the telepathy was still growing stronger. I could now hear thoughts from nearly 2 blocks away. The cacophony of human consciousness was driving me toward the same breakdown that had claimed Morrison's previous subjects. I understood now why he'd quoted exactly $200. It wasn't payment. It was bait. He needed test subjects for his ongoing research, and desperate people browsing late-night Craigslist ads were perfect targets. Some nights I can almost hear Morrison's voice in my head, taking notes, studying my deteriorating mental state like I'm a lab rat in his eternal experiment. He got exactly what he paid for. Another subject to observe, another mind to study as it slowly fractures under the weight of unwanted knowledge. I stopped the nightmares about Sarah, just like he promised. But now I have a new nightmare, one I can never wake up from, living inside everyone else's heads, hearing every cruel thought, every secret shame, every hidden fear. Morrison gave me exactly what I asked for, and so much more than I ever wanted. The stranger who sold me peace of mind took something infinitely more valuable in return, my sanity. And somewhere in the space between life and death, I think he's still taking notes. I met Rachel at a coffee shop in downtown Portland 3 months ago. She was sitting alone at a corner table, reading some thick psychology textbook, occasionally laughing at whatever she was reading. When she caught me staring, instead of looking annoyed, she smiled and asked if I wanted to join her. "It's a book about criminal psychology," she explained, tapping the cover. "Some of these case studies are so absurd they're almost funny. Listen to this. A guy in Wisconsin convinced his neighbors he was conducting scientific experiments in his basement for 2 years before anyone got suspicious." I laughed along with her, charmed by her quirky sense of humor. Rachel was beautiful, in an understated way. Shoulder-length brown hair, green eyes that seemed to notice everything, and this infectious laugh that made everyone around her smile. We talked for 3 hours that first day, and I knew I was falling hard. Our relationship moved quickly. Within a month, we were spending most nights together, usually at my apartment. Rachel said she preferred my place because hers was kind of a mess and she was embarrassed about it. She'd always deflect when I suggested coming over, suggesting a restaurant or movie theater instead. "I'm not ready for the seeing each other's living spaces stage yet," she'd say with that charming smile. "It's too intimate. I need to work up to it." I found her shyness endearing. In a world of people oversharing on social media, Rachel's privacy felt refreshing. She didn't even have Instagram or Facebook, claiming she preferred real-world connections. The first red flag should have been how she reacted to missing persons flyers. Portland has a problem with people disappearing, usually homeless individuals or runaways that most people barely notice. But Rachel noticed everything. She'd stop and stare at every missing person poster we passed, reading them carefully, sometimes taking photos with her phone. "It's so sad," she'd say. "All these people with families who love them just vanishing without a trace. I wonder what really happens to them." The way she said it sent a chill down my spine, but I pushed the feeling away. Rachel was compassionate. That's all. She cared about people others ignored. 2 months in, she finally invited me to her house. "I think I'm ready," she said, squeezing my hand over dinner. "But promise me you won't judge me if it's messier than you expected." Rachel lived in a modest 2-story house in the Hawthorne district, exactly the kind of place you'd expect a social worker to live. The front yard was perfectly maintained with flower boxes under every window and a welcome mat that actually looked welcoming. Inside was immaculate, not just clean, but sterile. White walls, minimal furniture, everything in its designated place. The living room had a single couch facing a small TV, a bookshelf filled with psychology texts, and absolutely no personal photographs. "Sorry, it's so boring," Rachel said, hanging up my jacket. I'm not much of a decorator. We spent the evening watching Netflix and ordering Thai food. Everything felt normal, comfortable even. Around 11 p.m., Rachel excused herself to use the bathroom upstairs. While she was gone, I heard a strange sound coming from somewhere below us. A rhythmic thumping, like someone hammering or maybe working out. "Do you have a roommate?" I asked when she returned. "What?" "No. Why?" "I thought I heard something from downstairs. Maybe the basement?" Rachel's smile flickered for just a moment. "Oh, that's just the old furnace. The landlord keeps saying he'll fix it, but you know how landlords are." It was July. In Portland, nobody runs their furnace in July. But Rachel was already curling up next to me on the couch, and her explanation seemed plausible enough. Old houses make weird noises. I let it go. Over the next few weeks, I spent several more evenings at Rachel's place. Each time I'd hear those sounds from the basement, thumping, scraping, occasionally what sounded like muffled voices. When I mentioned it, Rachel always had an explanation. Pipes, the washing machine, neighbors working late in their garage. The excuses were getting elaborate, and I started paying closer attention. The sounds were definitely coming from directly beneath us, not from next door. And they only happened at night, usually after 10 p.m. Last Tuesday, Rachel fell asleep on the couch during a movie. I needed to use the bathroom, but didn't want to wake her by going upstairs. I remembered seeing a half bath near the kitchen and went looking for it. That's when I found the basement door. It was tucked behind the kitchen, painted the same white as the walls, so it almost disappeared. Most importantly, it had 3 heavy-duty deadbolts on the outside. You don't put 3 deadbolts on the outside of a door to keep people from getting in. You put them there to keep something from getting out. I stood there for 10 minutes, staring at those locks, listening to the faint sounds coming from below. Not thumping this time, but voices. Definitely human voices, though I couldn't make out words. My rational mind offered innocent explanations. Maybe Rachel had a workshop down there, or a recording studio, or was subletting to someone who preferred privacy. But my gut knew better. Every instinct I had was screaming at me to leave, to run, to never come back. Instead, I crept back to the living room and pretended to be asleep when Rachel woke up an hour later. The next morning, I couldn't stop thinking about those deadbolts. I did something I'm not proud of. I drove past Rachel's house during lunch break to see if I could learn anything else. Her car wasn't there, so I walked around to the backyard. The basement had 2 small windows at ground level, both painted, black from the inside. But one had a small scratch in the paint just big enough to peek through. What I saw will haunt me forever. The basement had been converted into what looked like a series of cells. Small rooms with reinforced doors, each with a narrow slot at the bottom. I could see at least 4 separate spaces, maybe more. In the dim light, I caught a glimpse of movement in one of them. A shadow passing by the door. Someone was down there. Multiple people from what I could tell. I stumbled backward, my mind reeling. Rachel, sweet, caring, psychology-obsessed Rachel, was keeping people in her basement. The missing person flyers, her fascination with criminal psychology, her secretive behavior about her house. It all made horrifying sense. I drove straight to the police station, but when I tried to explain what I'd seen, the desk sergeant looked at me like I was insane. A scratch of missing paint and some shadows didn't constitute evidence. They'd need a warrant, and for that they'd need probable cause I couldn't provide. "Look, kid," the sergeant said, "if you're really concerned, file a formal complaint and we'll do a welfare check. But it sounds like you're letting your imagination run wild." I filed the complaint, but I knew it would take days to process. Meanwhile, Rachel was texting me, wondering why I hadn't returned her calls. "Everything okay, babe? You seem distant lately." That evening, she showed up at my apartment uninvited. When I opened the door, she was holding flowers and wearing that Same beautiful smile that had first attracted me. "I brought dinner," she said, holding up a bag from my favorite restaurant. "I thought we could talk about whatever's been bothering you." I let her in, trying to act normal while my heart hammered against my ribs. As she unpacked the food in my kitchen, she kept glancing at me with those observant green eyes. "You know what's funny?" she said casually, setting out plates. "I saw a police car drive past my house today. Twice, actually. I wonder what that was about." The way she said it told me everything I needed to know. Rachel knew I'd seen something. The question was what she planned to do about it. "I've been thinking," she continued, moving closer to me. "Maybe it's time we took our relationship to the next level. I have some space opening up at my place. Room for one more if you're interested." Her smile never wavered, but something cold and calculating had crept into her voice. I realized with crystal clarity that I was looking at the last face several missing people had ever seen. "That sounds wonderful," I managed to say, "but I'm not ready for that step yet." I was using her own words against her, hoping she'd back off. Instead, her smile widened. "Oh, I think you're more ready than you realize," she said. "After all, you've already seen the basement." I was scrolling through Craigslist's electronics section at 2 a.m., hunting for a decent laptop I could actually afford. College textbooks had drained my savings, and my ancient MacBook had finally given up the ghost during finals week. I needed something functional for under $300, which in today's market is basically asking for a miracle. That's when I found the listing that seemed too good to be true. MacBook Pro 2019, perfect condition, $250 cash only. Must pick up tonight. The photos looked legitimate. A pristine silver laptop with all the original accessories. No damage, no wear marks, just a beautiful machine being sold for a fraction of its value. The seller's email was professional enough. "Hi, I'm moving overseas tomorrow and need this gone ASAP. First come, first served." I fired off a response immediately, and within 10 minutes I had an address and a pickup time of 3 a.m. The guy apologized for the weird hour, but insisted he had an early flight, and this was his only window. Desperation makes you ignore red flags, and I needed that laptop. The address led me to a rundown apartment complex in East Oakland, the kind of place where half the streetlights were busted and you didn't make eye contact with strangers. I found Unit 2B and knocked softly, not wanting to wake the neighbors. The door opened to reveal a tall, thin guy in his 30s with nervous eyes and shaky hands. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, constantly glancing over his shoulder. As he invited me inside, "You're here for the laptop, right?" he said, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the cool night air. Good. I'm Marcus, by the way." The apartment was mostly empty boxes and bare walls. In the middle of the living room sat the MacBook on a card table, looking even better in person than in the photos. Marcus hovered nearby as I examined it, checking the specs, testing the keyboard, verifying everything worked. "Why are you selling this so cheap?" I asked, because I had to know. Like I said, moving overseas. Need the cash, need it gone. His answer came too quickly, rehearsed. "You want it or not?" I wanted it. God, I wanted it so badly. But something about Marcus's behavior was setting off every alarm bell in my head. He kept checking his phone, pacing to the window, acting like he was expecting someone who shouldn't. Find him there. "Look," he said suddenly, "I'll be straight with you. I need this thing out of my life tonight. There's some personal stuff on here that I can't access to delete. If you're smart, you'll wipe the hard drive clean the second you get home and never look at what's on there." Now, I really should have walked away. When someone tells you not to look at something, especially something they're this desperate to get rid of, the intelligent move is to politely decline and leave. But I was 21, broke, and convinced I could handle whatever weird porn or embarrassing photos were on there. I handed him the cash. Marcus practically threw the laptop bag at me and ushered me toward the door. As I was leaving, he grabbed my arm with trembling fingers. "Promise me," he said, his eyes wide with something that looked like genuine terror. "Promise me you won't go looking through the old files. Just wipe it clean and use it for school, please." I promised, mostly to get out of there. Marcus's fear was contagious, and I wanted to be back in my own apartment as quickly as possible. Once home, I plugged in the MacBook and started it up. Everything functioned perfectly. Better than perfectly, actually. This thing ran like a dream, all the software up to date, battery life excellent. For a few hours I felt like I'd won the lottery, but curiosity is a hell of a drug. By sunrise, I was browsing through the previous user's files. Marcus had tried to delete most things, but he'd clearly never heard of recovery software. Within an hour, I'd restored hundreds of deleted files, photos, videos, documents, browser history. What I found wasn't weird porn or embarrassing selfies. It was surveillance footage, hours and hours of it, all featuring the same woman. The timestamps went back almost 2 years, showing her in what appeared to be her own home. Cooking breakfast, watching TV, sleeping, showering, talking on the phone. The angles suggested hidden cameras placed throughout her house. There were folders labeled with dates organized chronologically like some kind of documentary project. As I scrolled through the files, I watched this unknown woman's life unfold in terrifying detail. Marcus had been stalking her systematically, documenting her every movement. But it got worse. I found planning documents, floor plans of her house, with entry points marked. Her daily schedule meticulously tracked. Photos of her spare key's hiding place. Screenshots of her social media accounts, her work information, her family members' contact details. There were voice recordings too. Phone calls that had been intercepted somehow. Conversations with friends, family, co-workers. Marcus had compiled a psychological profile of this woman that was more detailed than anything the FBI would have on most criminals. The final folder was labeled Phase 2 and dated just 3 days ago. Inside were photos of the woman tied to a chair in what looked like Marcus's apartment. She was blindfolded, clearly terrified and very much alive. The photos were time-stamped, showing she'd been held there for at least 12 hours before the final image. Her chair was empty, restraints cut. My hands were shaking as I realized what I'd stumbled into. Marcus hadn't sold me a laptop because he was moving overseas. He'd sold it because it contained evidence of a kidnapping, and he needed it gone before the police connected him to whatever had happened to this woman. I was holding proof of a serious crime, and I'd paid for the privilege. I tried calling the police, but how do you explain that you bought a laptop full of stalking footage from someone at 3 a.m.? It sounded insane even to me. Instead, I spent the next 6 hours taking screenshots, copying files, building a case that law enforcement would have to take seriously. That's when I found the video labeled Final Message. Marcus appeared on screen, sitting in his empty apartment, looking directly into the camera. His nervous demeanor was gone, replaced by something cold and calculating. "If you're watching this," he said, "then you're the person who bought my laptop. Congratulations. You're now an accessory to kidnapping and murder. Your fingerprints are all over the evidence. You paid me in cash in the middle of the night, and you've spent hours going through files I specifically told you not to access." My stomach dropped as he continued. "See, I needed someone to take the fall for this. Someone desperate enough to make a stupid decision, someone who couldn't resist looking at things they shouldn't see. The police are going to find Sarah Morrison's body in about 6 hours, and when they do, they're going to trace that laptop right back to you." The video showed Marcus holding up my driver's license. He'd photographed it while I was examining the laptop, probably when I wasn't looking. "I've got your information, video of you in my apartment, and now you've got all the evidence on your computer. Good luck explaining that to the police. Oh, and that cash you paid me? I made sure to get your fingerprints on some other items first. Items that are currently planted at the crime scene." He smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I'd ever seen. "Thanks for the business," he said. "And next time someone..." I was desperate to get rid of my ex-boyfriend's stuff. 3 months after our breakup, his belongings were still scattered around my apartment like painful reminders of what we used to have. The gaming chair, the expensive headphones, the vintage record collection he'd been so proud of. It all had to go. Craigslist seemed like the fastest solution. I posted ads for everything, pricing items to sell quickly rather than maximize profit. I just wanted his presence erased from my space, so I could finally move on. The gaming chair was the first to get a response. Within an hour of posting, someone named David messaged me. Hi, Jessica. I'm very interested in the chair. Would $200 cash work? I can pick up tonight if that's convenient. I hadn't mentioned my name in the ad. I stared at my phone for a full minute, trying to remember if I'd signed the listing somehow. Maybe it pulled from my Craigslist account settings. I convinced myself there was a logical explanation and responded with my address and a pickup time of 7 p.m. David arrived exactly on time, driving a clean white sedan that looked freshly washed. He was probably in his 40s, average height with graying hair and wire-rimmed glasses that made him look like a college professor. Nothing threatening about him, just a regular middle-aged guy buying a used gaming chair. "You must be Jessica," he said with a warm smile as I opened the door. "Thank you so much for accommodating the evening pickup. I know it's not always convenient. 4 people. Again with my name. I decided to test him. "Actually, it's Jennifer," I lied. His smile never wavered. "Oh, I'm sorry. I could have sworn..." Well, never mind. Memory isn't what it used to be, but something in his eyes suggested he knew exactly what he'd said. David examined the chair thoroughly, testing every adjustment mechanism and running his hands over the upholstery. "This is in excellent condition," he said. "Your boyfriend took good care of it." I hadn't mentioned a boyfriend in the ad. Hell, I hadn't mentioned a boyfriend to anyone lately. The breakup was still too raw. "Ex-boyfriend," I corrected automatically, then immediately regretted giving him any personal information. "Ah, that explains the sudden sale," David said, nodding sympathetically. "Breakups are tough. Sometimes we need to clear out the old to make room for the new, right?" He counted out $200 in crisp 20s and helped me carry the chair to his car. As he loaded it into his trunk, he casually asked, "Getting rid of anything else? I'm always looking for good deals, and you seem to take excellent care of your belongings." Something about the way he said "your belongings" made my skin crawl, but I found myself telling him about the other items I had listed. He seemed particularly interested in the record collection. "Vinyl is so personal, isn't it?" he said. "You can tell a lot about someone from their music taste. What kind of records are we talking about?" I rattled off a few artists: Pink Floyd, Led Zeppelin, some obscure jazz albums my ex had collected. David's eyes lit up with each name I mentioned. "I'd love to take a look at those," he said. "Would tomorrow evening work? Say, around 8 p.m.? Part of me wanted to say no, but I needed the money and he seemed harmless enough. We arranged for him to come back the following night. After he left, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off about our interaction. I kept replaying his comments, the way he'd used my real name, his knowledge about the boyfriend situation. But every time I tried to pin down what bothered me, I came up empty. Maybe I was just paranoid from living alone for the first time in 2 years. The next evening, David arrived with a large duffel bag and that same pleasant smile. "Hope you don't mind," he said, patting the bag. "I brought some organizational supplies. I like to pack records properly to prevent damage during transport." He spent nearly an hour going through the collection, examining each album with the care of a museum curator. While he worked, he made casual conversation that felt increasingly invasive. "You work at the marketing firm downtown, right? On 5th Street? I'd never told him where I worked. "How did you know that?" David looked up from a Miles Davis album, his expression innocent. "Oh, I think you mentioned it yesterday. Or maybe I'm thinking of someone else. I meet so many people through these online sales. But I knew I hadn't mentioned my job. I was absolutely certain. You know," he continued, "I drive past that building sometimes. Beautiful architecture. You must have a great view from the 8th floor." My office was on the 8th floor. A chill ran down my spine, but David had already moved on, discussing the condition of a Beatles album like nothing had happened. I tried to tell myself it was a lucky guess, that maybe the building only had offices on certain floors. When he finished cataloging the records, David made an offer for the entire collection, more than I'd been hoping to get. He counted out the cash methodically, then carefully packed each album into his duffel bag using professional-grade protective sleeves. "You seem like you're settling in well to living alone," he said as he worked. "It can be an adjustment at first, but I bet you're enjoying the freedom." I definitely hadn't told him I lived alone. I should get going, David said, hefting the bag of records. Thanks again, Jessica. This has been a real pleasure. As he walked to his car, he turned back with an afterthought. Oh, by the way, you might want to get that lock on your back door fixed. It looked a little loose when I was checking out your patio earlier. He drove away before I could respond, leaving me standing in my doorway with my mouth open. I hadn't shown him my back door. I hadn't taken him anywhere near my patio. I ran through the apartment to the sliding glass door that led to my small balcony. The lock mechanism was indeed loose, something I'd been meaning to fix for weeks but kept forgetting about. You could only tell by actually testing it, jiggling the handle to feel the play in the mechanism. David had been on my patio. While I was distracted by the record collection, he'd somehow slipped outside and examined my door. My hands shaking, I called the police. But what could I tell them? A buyer had been friendly and knowledgeable. He'd paid full price and left peacefully. Officer Martinez took my statement with barely concealed skepticism. Did he threaten you in any way? She asked. No, but take anything that wasn't for sale? No, but he knew things about me that I never told him. Officer Martinez closed her notebook. Ma'am, in the internet age, it's pretty easy to find information about people. He could have looked you up on social media, done a reverse address search, any number of things. Unless he actually commits a crime or makes explicit threats, there's not much we can do. After she left, I spent 3 hours going through my social media accounts, adjusting privacy settings, checking what information was publicly available. I found nothing that would have told David my name, my workplace, or my living situation. That's when I decided to do some research of my own. I searched for David's phone number online and found something that made my blood freeze. The number had been linked to a dozen different Craigslist purchases over the past 2 years, all from young women selling personal belongings after breakups, moves, or other life transitions. But here's the terrifying part. I found forum posts from some of these women describing experiences almost identical to mine. A friendly buyer who knew too much, who'd somehow accessed areas of their homes they shouldn't have seen, who'd gathered personal information through means they couldn't explain. 3 of the women had reported break-ins within a month of selling. To David, nothing valuable was taken, but personal items had been moved, underwear had gone missing, and all reported feeling like someone had been living in their space. One woman had found photos on her phone that she didn't remember taking. Pictures of herself sleeping, showering, going about her daily routine. The metadata showed they'd been taken with her own device while she was unconscious. As I write this, it's been a week since David bought the records. I've changed my locks, installed a security system, and I'm staying with friends most nights. But I can't shake the feeling that he's still watching, still collecting information, still planning whatever comes next. I wanted to get rid of my ex's belongings to move forward with my life. Instead, I invited something much worse to take his place. I was furnishing my first apartment after college, trying to make it look like an adult lived there on a barista's budget. Craigslist had become my best friend. Every piece of furniture I owned was secondhand, and I'd gotten pretty good at spotting legitimate sellers versus scammers. That's why the listing caught my attention immediately. Beautiful mid-century modern dining set, barely used, priced at $300 for the table and 4 chairs. The photos showed exactly what I'd been dreaming of. Clean lines, rich walnut wood, the kind of furniture that belonged in a magazine spread, not a college graduate's cramped apartment. The seller's name was Tom, and his email was professional and friendly. Hi there, thanks for your interest. The set is in excellent condition. My ex-wife had expensive taste but we're downsizing after the divorce. Would you like to come take a look? I'm available most evenings this week. I scheduled a viewing for Thursday at 7 p.m. Tom's house was in a quiet suburban neighborhood, the kind of place where people knew their neighbors and kids played in front yards. A good sign. Scammers usually operated out of sketchy locations or insisted on meeting in parking lots. Tom answered the door with a warm smile. He was probably in his mid-40s, well-dressed in khakis and a polo shirt, with the kind of dad energy that immediately put me at ease. The house behind him was immaculate, decorated with the kind of coordinated furniture that screamed, "Married," for 15 years. "You must be Sarah," he said, extending his hand. "Come on in. The dining set is right through here." The furniture was even more beautiful in person. Not a scratch on it, the wood gleaming like it had just been polished. I ran my hands over the smooth surface while Tom stood nearby, hands in his pockets, watching my reaction. "It's gorgeous," I said honestly. "Your ex-wife really did have great taste." "She did," Tom agreed, but something in his voice had changed. Darker, more bitter. "Cost me a fortune, this set, but she insisted we needed quality pieces that would last. Guess she didn't apply that philosophy to our marriage." I made sympathetic noises while continuing to examine the chairs. Everything looked perfect. No wobbles, no wear marks. Exactly what I'd been hoping to find. "I'll take it," I said, pulling out my wallet. "Cash okay?" "Actually," Tom said, "I'm still expecting a few more people to come look at it this week. Could you give me a small deposit to hold it? Say $50? Then you can come back Saturday to pick it up with the rest of the payment." It was a reasonable request, and I was worried someone else would snatch up such a great deal. I handed him $50 and we shook on it. "Perfect," Tom said, walking me toward the door. "Saturday around 2 p.m. work for you? I'll have everything ready to go." As we reached the entryway, Tom paused. "Oh, by the way, bring a friend if you can. This stuff is heavier than it looks, and I threw out my back last week. Can't help much with loading." Saturday afternoon, I showed up with my roommate Jake and his pickup truck. Tom greeted us at the door, but something about his demeanor had shifted since Thursday. He seemed more intense, his smile not quite reaching his eyes. "Great, you brought help," he said. But he was looking at Jake in a way that made me uncomfortable. Like he was sizing him up, calculating something. "Actually," Tom continued, "I ran into a small problem. The dining set is down in the basement now. I was doing some cleaning and moved it out of the way. Hope you don't mind coming downstairs to get it." Red flags started going off in my head, but Jake was already following Tom toward a door I hadn't noticed during my first visit. I trailed behind, every instinct telling me something was wrong. The basement was unfinished, with concrete walls and bare bulbs hanging from the ceiling. It smelled musty and damp, nothing like the pristine house upstairs. Tom led us toward the back corner where the dining set sat in the shadows. "There she is," Tom said, but he wasn't looking at the furniture. He was positioning himself between us and the stairs. That's when I noticed the other furniture scattered around the basement. Dozens of pieces. Couches, tables, dressers, mirrors, all arranged like some kind of showroom. But these weren't the coordinated pieces from upstairs. This furniture was mismatched, different styles and conditions, like it had come from many different homes. "Wow," Jake said, looking around. "You've got quite the collection down here." Tom's smile widened, but it had turned predatory. "You could say that. I've been collecting for a while now. People are so trusting when they think they're getting a good deal." I grabbed Jake's arm. "We should go. I changed my mind about the table." "Oh, I don't think so," Tom said, and suddenly there was a gun in his hand. "You see, the dining set was never really for sale. It was just bait to get you down here." My heart stopped. Jake stepped protectively in front of me, but Tom just laughed. "Relax, I'm not going to shoot you. Not unless you do something stupid. The gun is just to keep you calm while I explain how this works." He gestured around the basement with his free hand. "Every piece of furniture down here came from someone like you. Young people new to the area looking for deals online. They come to buy a dresser or a couch and they end up contributing to my collection permanently." "What do you want?" Jake asked, his voice steady despite the circumstances. "Oh, it's not about what I want from you," Tom said. "It's about what you're going to do for me. You see, I need people to help me acquire new inventory, and you two are going to help me expand my operation." He pulled out his phone and showed us a dozen different Craigslist listings. All furniture, all priced to sell quickly, all with different seller names and locations. I post these ads, people respond, and then I give them addresses where they can pick up their purchases. Addresses of people who have nice things I'd like to add to my collection. The buyers show up expecting furniture. The homeowners think they're being robbed. And in the chaos, things get taken that never make it to police reports. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. Tom was using eager buyers as unwitting accomplices in burglaries. People would break into homes looking for furniture that didn't exist, creating diversions while he took what he really wanted. "You're insane," I whispered. "I'm efficient," Tom corrected. "Do you know how hard it is to rob houses these days? Security systems, cameras, neighbors who work from home. But if I send someone to the front door with a reasonable story about buying furniture, homeowners let their guard down. And if things go wrong, well, I was never there." He showed us photos on his phone, houses that had been ransacked, families, looking confused and frightened as they talked to police officers. These weren't random break-ins. They were coordinated attacks using innocent people as tools. "Here's what's going to happen," Tom said. "You're going to help me with a few pickups over the next month. Nothing violent, nothing too dangerous. Just knock on doors, ask about furniture, keep people distracted while I work. Do a good job and I'll let you go with a warning about staying quiet." "And if we refuse?" Jake asked. Tom's smile turned cold. "Then you become permanent residents of my basement furniture showroom. I've got plenty of room and honestly, I could use the help organizing everything." Looking around at the dozens of furniture pieces, I realized we weren't the first people Tom had brought down here. Some of those chairs and tables probably belonged to people who'd said no to his offer. But Jake was already moving. While Tom was distracted by his own monologue, Jake had grabbed a heavy ceramic lamp from a nearby end table. He swung it at Tom's, gun hand connecting with a solid crack. Tom screamed and dropped the weapon. I lunged for it while Jake tackled Tom to the ground. Within seconds, the situation had reversed. We had the gun, and Tom was bleeding from his broken wrist. "Call the police," Jake said, pinning Tom down. "And let's see what other evidence we can find down here." We found plenty. Tom had been running his furniture scam for over 3 years, and he'd kept detailed records of every operation. Photos of victims, addresses of targeted homes, even spreadsheets tracking which stolen items had sold for the most money. The police found 7 people locked in a hidden room behind the basement's back wall. All of them had responded to Tom's furniture ads, and all of them had refused to cooperate with his burglary scheme. I never did get that dining set. Turns out it was stolen from a family in Portland whose daughter had been killed in a car accident. They'd been selling her belongings to cope with their grief, and Tom had robbed them while they were at the funeral. These days, I only buy furniture from actual stores. It costs more, but at least I know the only thing for sale is what's advertised. Some deals are too good to be true because they were never really deals at all. I was hunting for vintage vinyl records on Craigslist, specifically looking for obscure jazz albums from the 1960s. My grandfather had been a collector, and after he passed, I'd developed an obsession with finding the rare pressings he'd always talked about but never owned. That's when I found Harold's listing. Rare jazz collection, 1950s, 1970s, serious collectors only. Some very unusual pressings, $2,000 for the lot. No cherry-picking individual albums. $2,000 was steep, but the photos showed dozens of albums I'd never seen before. Labels I didn't recognize. Artist names that weren't in any discography I could find. If even half of them were legitimate rarities, the collection would be worth 10 times what Harold was asking. I emailed immediately, and Harold responded within the hour with an address in the old warehouse district downtown. "Come tonight if you're serious. I keep irregular hours and won't be available again for weeks." The building was a converted loft in a neighborhood that gentrification had forgotten. Harold buzzed me up to the 4th floor without asking who I was, like he'd been expecting me. The man who opened the door looked to be in his 70s with wild gray hair and clothes that seemed decades out of date. His apartment was floor-to-ceiling records, thousands of them, organized in a system only he could understand. "You're the jazz enthusiast," Harold said, more statement than question. "Good. I was beginning to think serious collectors were extinct." He led me to a corner where several crates of albums sat waiting. As I flipped through them, I realized I was looking at musical history that shouldn't exist. Albums by famous musicians recorded on dates when they were supposedly touring other continents. Collaborations between artists who'd never met. live recordings from venues that had burned down years before the supposed concert dates. "Where did these come from?" I asked, holding up what appeared to be a Miles Davis album I'd never heard. "Of private sessions," Harold said cryptically. "Musicians recorded a lot more than what made it to commercial release. I've spent 40 years tracking down these lost sessions. Some of the albums didn't even have proper labels, just handwritten titles and dates in fading ink. Others bore the logos of record companies that had never existed, at least not in any reality I knew." "I'll take the whole collection," I said, pulling out my checkbook. This was clearly a once-in-a-lifetime find. Harold watched me write the check with an expression I couldn't read. "Word of advice," he said, as he took my payment. "Start with the mainstream stuff, the Coltrane, the Parker reissues. Work your way up to the more unusual recordings." "What's unusual about them?" "You'll understand when you're ready," Harold said, already packing the albums into milk crates. "Just remember, some music changes you, and once you're changed, you can't go back." I loaded the crates into my car, excited to spend the weekend exploring my new collection. Back home, I set up my turntable and started with a Thelonious Monk album that looked relatively normal. The music was exactly what I expected: brilliant, complex jazz that transported me to a smoky club in 1962. Encouraged, I moved on to some of the stranger albums. That's when things started getting weird. The first unusual record was labeled Charlie Parker, Studio Session No. 47, May 15, 1955. Parker had died in March 1955, but the music that came out of my speakers was undeniably his alto saxophone, recorded with crystal clarity that shouldn't have been possible with 1950s technology. I told myself it must be a mislabeled recording from before his death. But as I listened closer, Parker was playing compositions I'd never heard, intricate, haunting melodies that seemed to predict musical developments that wouldn't happen for decades. The next album was even stranger: Miles Davis and John Coltrane. The Unrecorded Sessions, July 1959. Both musicians were alive in 1959, but according to every biography I'd read, they weren't speaking to each other that summer due to creative differences. Yet here they were, playing together with an intimacy and understanding that surpassed their most famous collaborations. The music was transcendent. So beautiful it brought tears to my eyes. So perfect it felt like eavesdropping on a conversation between gods. That first night, I listened to 12 albums. Each one featured impossible collaborations, recordings that couldn't exist. Music that seemed to come from a parallel universe where jazz had evolved differently. When I finally went to bed at 4 a.m., the melodies followed me into sleep. I dreamed I was in a recording studio with no windows, watching musicians who'd been dead for decades play with the passion of people still discovering their art. Charlie Parker was there, younger than he'd ever been in life, his saxophone producing sounds that had never touched waking ears. Miles Davis stood in the corner, his trumpet glowing with an inner light, playing counter melodies that wouldn't exist for another 20 years. In the dream, they could see me watching. Parker smiled and nodded toward a microphone I hadn't noticed. "Your turn," he said. "Every listener eventually becomes a performer." I woke up with my throat raw like I'd been singing for hours. The next evening, I couldn't resist putting on another album. This one was labeled simply, The Session, December 32nd, 1963. December 32nd wasn't a real date, but the music was more real than anything I'd ever heard. It was a solo piano piece, but somehow I could hear orchestral arrangements that weren't there, horn sections playing in frequencies only my mind could detect. The pianist was someone I didn't recognize, playing compositions that seemed to rewrite the laws of harmony with every measure. As I listened, I started humming along. Not consciously, but like the melodies were pulling sound from my throat against my will. By the end of the 40-minute piece, I was singing wordless vocals in perfect harmony with music I'd never heard before. This became a pattern. Each night I'd play another impossible album, and each night I'd find myself participating in the music more actively. Humming, singing, sometimes even moving my fingers like I was playing along on an invisible instrument. The dreams intensified, too. The recording studio became more detailed, more real than my waking life. I started recognizing the other listeners, shadowy figures sitting in chairs around the room's perimeter, all of us drawn by music that shouldn't exist. "Welcome to the session," Charlie Parker said during one dream. "You're making good progress. Soon you'll be ready for the real recordings." "What are the real recordings?" I asked. Miles Davis lowered his trumpet and looked at me with eyes that held infinite sadness. "The music we make now. The compositions that exist only in the space between sleep and waking. The songs that can only be heard by people who've listened to enough impossible things." I woke up to find musical notation written in my own handwriting scattered across my desk. Complex compositions I had no memory of creating, written in a style I'd never studied. By the third week, I wasn't sleeping at all. The music had become too compelling, too necessary. I'd play albums all night and find myself transported entirely, not just listening, but existing inside the songs themselves. My neighbors started complaining about noise, but I wasn't playing the records loudly. The music was somehow getting into the building's walls, seeping through electrical systems, turning the entire structure into a resonating chamber. When I went to work, I could hear phantom melodies underlying every conversation. The copy machine hummed in B-flat minor. Fluorescent lights buzzed in perfect fifths. The world had become musical, but it was a music only I could perceive. That's when I realized what Harold had been warning me about. The albums weren't just recordings, they were invitations. Each impossible song was a doorway into a place where music existed independently of time, space, or the limitations of human mortality. The more I listened, the more I became part of that eternal session. Last night, I dreamed I was sitting at the piano in that windowless studio, my fingers finding melodies that had never been played by living hands. The other musicians smiled and nodded their approval as I contributed my first composition to their impossible catalog. When I woke up, there was a new album sitting on my turntable. The label read, "Your first session, tonight's date," in my own handwriting. I haven't played it yet. I'm scared of what I'll hear. Scared of what I'll become if I listen to music I apparently created while asleep. But the melody is already in my head, growing stronger by the hour. I can hear Charlie Parker calling from the other room, his saxophone, weaving invitations I'm finding harder to resist. The session is about to begin, and I think I'm ready to stop being just a listener.